You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, we got some surprise news out of the New York courtroom today where Donald Trump is awaiting sentencing that may actually have a big impact on his September 18th sentencing. So first off, can you explain what just happened in New York?
Yeah, Brian. So Donald Trump is so desperate to avoid the sentencing that is coming up on September 18th. That's for his 34 felony convictions for the crimes he committed to cheat in the 2016 presidential election, that he just tried a second time to get his case removed, meaning transferred from New York State Court into New York Federal Court. Importantly, he tried to do this about a year ago. And the federal judge who caught this assignment, Judge Hellerstein, had a hearing and said, no, making these hush money payments and then falsifying business records to cover them up are not official presidential acts, which interestingly, Brian, we've heard a lot about official presidential acts recently because of the Supreme Court opinion. Well, anytime a federal government employee or officer wants to try to get their case moved from state court into federal court, they have to prove what? That these were official governmental duties. So there are a lot of parallels and similarities between these two issues. And Judge Hellerstein said, Donald Trump, a year ago, you tried to pull this same thing, and I ruled after a hearing that none of what you did constituted an official presidential act, so I denied your request, and that's why Donald Trump had to go to trial in New York, got convicted in a New York minute on those 34 felony counts, and is now pending sentencing. Well, Donald Trump tried it again. He said, wait, Judge Hellerstein, everything has changed because the Supreme Court has now said I have absolute immunity for official presidential acts. And our viewers, Brian, can probably already see where I'm going with this. And let me just read a couple of choice lines from Judge Hellerstein's 3-page judicial smackdown of Donald Trump's most recent attempt to pull his case out of New York court and put it in federal court. First of all, not surprisingly, what Donald Trump's lawyers filed sounded a lot like a 2 a.m. Donald Trump post. Why? Because what they do is they say, Judge Merchan was so unfair. He was so conflicted. We didn't get a fair trial. And here is how Judge Hellerstein handled that argument. He said, this court does not have jurisdiction to hear Mr. Trump's arguments concerning the propriety of the New York trial. District courts, federal courts, may not reverse or modify state court judgments. And then he said, accordingly, this argument doesn't even merit my attention. You gotta love that. He cut right to the chase. Now, he turned to the second argument. The second argument was, well, Judge Hellerstein, everything has changed because of the Supreme Court ruling saying I have presidential immunity for official acts. And here is how Judge Hellerstein rejected that claim. He said, I held in my order and opinion of July 19th, 2023, about a year ago, that hush money paid to an adult film star is not related to a president's official acts. It does not reflect in any way the color of the president's official duties. My holding of a hush money reimbursement remains true, and nothing in the Supreme Court opinion affects my previous conclusion that the hush money payments were private, unofficial acts outside the bounds of executive authority. He therefore rejects it and orders his clerk to dismiss this motion from Donald Trump. And Brian, it's important for a couple of reasons, because there's some really great foreshadowing in there about how the courts should look at Donald Trump's claim that the things he did were official presidential acts. So therefore, in the wake of the Supreme Court ruling, he should get a pass, a get out of jail free card. He should get immunity. Well, Judge Hellerstein seems to have laid that to rest pretty definitively.
Glenn, can you talk about the likelihood or the impact that this is going to have, rather, on Donald Trump's sentencing on September 18th? Both the fact that Donald Trump's effort to have this removed to the federal court system failed, but then also more broadly the likelihood of sentencing happening on the 18th anyway.
Yeah, so great question. So first of all, this actually clears a hurdle away, right? Donald Trump had tried desperately to get this case pulled out of state court, put into federal court. Judge Hellerstein would have none of it. So if Judge Hellerstein had granted the motion, it probably would have put a stop to the upcoming sentencing date for Donald Trump. So another hurdle now cleared away. Then the second question is a little bit tougher to answer definitively. Will he go to sentencing on September 18th? I wish I could say I'm confident that he will, but here's my concern, Brian. On September 16th, Judge Merchan said he will issue his opinion on presidential immunity. In other words, whether the Supreme Court ruling that came down after Donald Trump was convicted of those 34 felony crimes warrants any kind of relief or any kind of continuance or any kind of alteration of his 34 felony convictions. Now, I have a feeling, and Judge Hellerstein's ruling kind of dovetails nicely with this, I have a feeling Judge Merchan will say, no, not official acts. I deny your motion to dismiss your case based on the Supreme Court ruling, and I'm ready to proceed to sentencing in 2 days because he said he's going to hand down that decision on September 16th. Donald Trump has already promised that he is going to run like the wind, at least figuratively, to appeals courts, both state and federal. It's an open question whether he has any legal opportunity to jump into federal court, but he said he's going to try to do it, and he's going to try to put a stop to his sentencing in those intervening 48 hours between the 16th and the 18th. So it's anybody's guess as to whether he'll be successful and whether that will put up another obstacle to his sentencing actually proceeding on September 18th that maybe the state court can't clear away. So that's going to be, a really interesting time between the 16th and the 18th. And it's just an unanswerable question as to whether he will proceed to sentencing on the 18th.
Glenn, does the fact that Donald Trump failed in his effort to get this thing removed to the federal court system just now, today, does that offer some type of insight or prediction in terms of how successful Donald Trump will or won't be when he tries to appeal this thing to the U.S. Supreme Court on the 16th, 2 days before his sentencing on the 18th?
It offers some insight. It's not precedent, but there's something that I often refer to as atmospheric precedent. Once you have federal court judges repeatedly ruling that, no, what Donald Trump did when he was committing these crimes in the context of our discussion here in violation of New York state law, what he did was the farthest thing imaginable from official presidential acts. That may not be precedent, but it is important, it's relevant, and it begins to paint the picture that courts are prepared to say, no, Donald Trump should not enjoy any kind of immunity, at least not for falsifying business records, to cover up hush money payments, to cheat in a presidential election. And I think by extension, that same rationale may end up applying to many of the acts that Donald Trump undertook on and around January 6th, where we are in the process of trying to get that same question answered. Is any of it official presidential conduct such that he can't be prosecuted for it? I think it's a good decision and ruling by Judge Hellerstein. I think it begins to set the tone and hopefully even the agenda, and hopefully Donald Trump will begin losing these immunity cases and arguments one after another.
Now, you had mentioned that this was an obstacle, a barrier that prosecutors have been able to overcome in terms of getting Donald Trump one day closer to sentencing. What is the next biggest obstacle that we're awaiting? Is it Donald Trump's appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court on the 16th? Is that the next big obstacle, the next big hurdle that we have to encounter here?
Yes, and even before he gets to the Supreme Court, the first thing he'll do, I predict, and Trump's lawyers have signaled he will do this, assuming Judge Merchan says, no presidential immunity for you, we're going to sentencing in 2 days on the 18th, he will first file an emergency stay with Judge Merchan. If it's rejected, he will file that same emergency stay with the New York Appeals Court, and simultaneously, he may also try to file something in the federal court to try to, belt and suspenders this thing, try to get some court to interfere with his upcoming sentencing date. And if all else fails, he'll try to bubble it up to the Supreme Court as quickly as possible. And because it is such a novel issue, it's really kind of the first time this legal challenge is being litigated and decided after the Supreme Court issued its unconstitutional, in my opinion, ruling granting presidents absolute immunity. I do think it will tend to kind of slow things down, maybe freeze things, albeit only temporarily. So, I think there are still those several hurdles that will have to be overcome before Judge Merchan will be in a position to pronounce sentence.
And finally, let's finish off with this. Can you explain how egregiously inappropriate it would be, given how few cases the U.S. Supreme Court actually hears, for them to take up not only yet another case from Donald Trump, but one that is so obviously belongs in the New York case system and that doesn't have any rationale to be moved over to the federal court system?
Brian, how many favors can this corrupt Supreme Court, at least the extreme right-wing bloc of 6, how many favors can they do for Donald Trump? Because they have done nothing but try to protect Donald Trump from the consequences of his own conduct and his own crimes. And that includes being adjudicated an insurrectionist by a state trial court as affirmed by a state appeals court, and then all of those textualists on the Supreme Court saying, well, we understand the text of the Constitution says an insurrectionist, after he takes an oath to support and defend the Constitution, is disqualified from holding office again. Nah, we're going to ignore that text of the Constitution. How many favors can this Supreme Court do for Donald Trump? Should they let this state court issue bubble up to the Supreme Court, jump into the federal system, and immediately bubble up to the Supreme Court within 48 hours? The answer is hell no. Will they? I'm done predicting what this corrupt 6-block, radical right wing of the Supreme Court will do, because they've made clear they're not honest brokers of the law. They have Donald Trump's back at every turn, even if they have to ignore or contradict the express language of the Constitution to give him the break that they seem desperate to give him.
Right. And what underscores all of that is the fact that this was all done prior to Donald Trump even taking office. The whole point of him committing these crimes and writing these checks, for example, was because he wanted to present himself in a good light to the electorate before he became president. So the notion then that the U.S. Supreme Court has some jurisdiction here is completely backwards. And yet the fact that you and I both have no idea whether that means that the U.S. Supreme Court won't still try anyway is a testament to how broken that court is and how willing they are to bend over backwards on his behalf.
Yeah, and it feels like the death of irony is what we're experiencing.
Right. Well, we will, of course, stay on top of this, and I don't want it to get lost in the bad news of what this U.S. Supreme Court is, that we did overcome a hurdle with this news here today. So we will, of course, stay on top of this. It's the beginning of September. The next 2 weeks are going to have a lot of news as it relates to this impending sentencing in New York for his 34 felony convictions. So for those watching right now, if you want to follow along with this, as soon as we have new news, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on this screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.